Once the foot position has been set, you move on to setting the bike's saddle height. Start off with the saddle clamped centrally on the seat post. Most saddles have markings on their rails which you can use to help. Make sure the top of the saddle is set parallel to the ground. You'll need a spirit level to do this, and it's probably best to check this before you mount the bike on the turbo trainer. The top surface of most saddles is flat, but some have a curved top. If you've got one of those, you should concentrate on levelling the part of the saddle which is usually sat on directly. Get your rider to sit on the bike and put the heel of their less dominant leg on the pedal. So if they play football and prefer kicking with their right foot, use their left heel for this. They should move the pedal to a low position so that the crank is in line with the seat tube of the bike's frame. In that position, the pedal will be as far away from the rider as it can be. The saddle height should be set so that the rider has their leg completely straight with their knee locked in this position. With the saddle height set in this position, the rider should now move their feet to their normal position on the pedals that we set earlier, and they should be able to pedal without their hips rocking. It's easiest to check this from behind the rider. We use that same process for setting saddle height, whether the child uses training shoes with flat pedals or specialist cycling shoes with clipless pedals. It's true that the heels of different shoes vary a lot in height, but the method still works because a shoe with a thick heel, like a training shoe, usually has a thick sole too, and a cycling shoe with a low heel usually has a thin sole. This gives you a starting point to fine-tune the saddle height from, and in this position there should be a slight knee bend when the rider's leg is at the bottom of the pedal stroke. There are quite a few different factors which could affect the precise saddle height, and you might well need to alter it because of the rider's foot length, their flexibility and the types of pedals that they use. You should remember that some pedal systems and some cycling shoes will raise the rider's foot further above the pedal axle than others. This affects their leg extension, so you need to take account of it when you set the saddle height. For example, a lot of young riders use mountain bike shoes and clipless pedals, and those shoes will often have the shoe plate, or cleat, recessed into the tread of the shoe. On the other hand, some road shoes have their shoe plates positioned a lot further below the sole of the foot. The top surface of some pedals, where the foot rests on the pedal, is higher above the axle than others. Some running shoes have very thick soles, so using them with flat pedals affects the saddle height needed too. So take all those factors into account if your child changes pedals or shoes. You'll need to recalculate their saddle height using that particular pedal and shoe combination. It's important to keep a record of the right saddle height so you can set up your child on a new bike or on a higher bike when you need to. There are lots of very slightly different ways of measuring the saddle height, but as long as you stick to the same way of doing it each time, that's okay. We suggest this easy way to do it. Put the pedal in a position so that the crank extends in a straight line from the frame seat tube in the same way that you used to set the saddle height earlier. Measure in a straight line from the top surface of the pedal, just where the pedal screws into the crank arm, along the crank and the seat tube right up to the top surface of the saddle. Remember that the Q factor of your particular bike's chain set could make a difference of up to 5 mm to the saddle height measurement that you take. In other words, if you measure the saddle height of a bike that has its pedals far apart, you'll get a bigger number than you would when measuring a bike that has its pedals closer together. So bear that in mind when comparing saddle heights between bikes. Now that the saddle height has been set, we can move on to setting the fore and aft position of the saddle. In other words, how far forwards or backwards the saddle should be positioned. The traditional way of doing this was to use a plumb line from the front of the knee, which is furthest forward to the pedal spindle below it when the cranks are horizontal. There's no biomechanical basis for this measurement, and it's affected by the length of your particular cranks, but it does give you a good starting point. Also, remember that if you've moved the saddle forwards or backwards, you should check and adjust the saddle height again, because moving the saddle might have altered the geometry of where your rider is now sitting. Now check your rider's pedalling action. If they're particularly pointing their toes when pedalling, then the saddle height may be too high or their saddle might be set too far forward. If they tend to drop their heels while pedalling, then the saddle might be set too far back. But people do have different pedalling styles anyway, so bear that in mind too when you're checking the pedalling action for toes being pointed down or heels being dropped. Also, bear in mind that just because you move the saddle forwards, for example, that doesn't mean that your rider will actually sit any further forward. They might just sit in the same position as before, but on a different part of the saddle. Riders will often change the way they sit and the position they ride in, depending upon how hard they're trying, how fast they're pedalling, and what kind of riding they're doing. A lot of riders will sit further back on the saddle when climbing a long hill, for example. So spend some time watching your rider, getting to know how they tend to ride, and think about how that might affect the way you set up their riding position.